Hi, I'm Kat, the Apprentice Maven, and I know some things and I'll teach you, but I don't know a lot more things and I'll teach me too. Mostly though, we're gonna have fun. Let's go. The first stitch I'm gonna teach you is a running stitch. So once you have your needle threaded, in order to knot, what you'll do is you'll hold the thread parallel to your needle, pinch it between your two fingers, wrap it around the needle a couple of times, and then make sure that the wound bit is pinched in between your two fingers. It'll look like that. You don't open up your fingers or you might lose it. And then you just pull your needle through and it will knot for you automatically. Kind of sneaky. I'm not one of those people that can do that magic thing where you wind it around and you twist it and then it comes through. My knots always come out when I do that. Anyway, so running stitch. A running stitch just starts in the back. So you would have two pieces of fabric. I just have the one. And you would put right sides together. And this is just a basic stitch. You want to make sure that your stitches are pretty small, but you just weave it in and out. And this is the kind of stitch that you would use when you have a seam that isn't going to take a whole lot of stress. So this works well for things like side skirt seams and things like that. Things that aren't going to have a whole lot of stress on them. You don't want to do these for seams that are going to get a lot of wear. So like things in the corners, probably not a great idea. You do get better the more you practice it. Again, my stitches are not terribly even. I don't do this stitch very often. As a matter of fact, I don't hand stitch nearly as often as I used to. But that's your basic running stitch. It's just in and out. This is what most people think of when they think of people hand sewing. So I'm going to cut that off because the next thing I'm going to show you is very similar. It's a basting stitch. So I'm just going to go ahead and knot my thread again. There we go. A basting stitch is just like a running stitch, but the stitches are bigger. There are a couple of situations where you might want to use a basting stitch. Sometimes you would use a basting stitch when you want to remove the stitches later. Sorry, great shot of my hand. Or sometimes you need this to do gathering. And sometimes you end up taking those stitches out and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you leave them in. Just kind of depends. And if your fabric is fighting you, like this one's fighting me, just take it one stitch at a time. No big deal. No hurry. And of course, you're gonna have a line that you're gonna follow. So yours is gonna be a lot more even than mine. But again, this one's gonna be temporary, not that crucial. The next one I want to show you is a back stitch. I'm actually going to turn it this way, make it a little bit easier to work with. So a back stitch, you're going to come up and then you're going to go back to the hole you came out of before, and then past it, up, and then back into where the last stitch ended. Up and then back to where the last stitch ended. So this is a very, very strong stitch, and this is the one that I most often use. If you're going to be hand stitching garments or seams like that, this is the one that you're going to want to use when you have a seam that's going to take a lot more stress and pressure. Oops, seem to have gotten a knot. So you want to try and make sure that your stitches are approximately the same size. This does take some practice. Now, if you're going to have an outside and an inside where the seam is going to show, you want to make sure that your outside seam, the one that everybody's going to see, is the one that's facing up. The one that, see, that's very crooked. No big deal. This takes practice. Because the top side of your fabric is going to be a lot tidier than the back side of the fabric. And you can see there's a lot more wiggle room in that kind of stitch. So, and that's a back stitch. So that is the one that my grandmother taught me when she was teaching me how to sew. However, there's another kind of back stitch that I learned very recently that's similar, but not really the same. So this back stitch here, I'm gonna come up way out here. So this one uses much smaller stitches to go back, and then it comes out a normal size stitch. So it's a lot less visible on the top of your fabric. Oops. And fabric's fighting me, thread's fighting me. Okay, when that happens, what you want to do is try and separate your strands. You might have gotten themselves all wound up and stuff. Try and separate your strands. Just pull one of them and then the other one until you find the one that's looped up. All right, so this one just goes back a little bit, doesn't go all the way back to that stitch, and then continues on. So it ends up being a lot less visible than the normal back stitch that I was taught. I just learned this one. I'm not very good at it yet. Haven't had much chance to practice. Haven't really done a whole heck of a lot of hand stitching lately, if I'm honest. That's sort of what it looks like. So those are two different kinds of back stitches. The next couple of stitches I'm going to show you have to do with hemming. This one's one of my favorite ones because it's got a little bit of give in it. So especially if you're hemming something like a pair of pants, you want it to have a little bit of play in it because clothes move. We move, our clothes move. So you want it to be able to wiggle a little bit. So this one is, I've actually heard it called a couple of different things. I've heard it called a cross stitch. I've heard it called a herringbone stitch. But basically you're gonna hold your needle facing the opposite direction that you're traveling across the fabric. So my pointy end is facing this way, but I'm going to be traveling that way. So you're going to come up behind the hem. Now this is going to be the inside of your pant leg or whatever it is you're hemming. So nobody's going to see this part. But the idea is that you want to make sure that you're taking up as few threads as possible from the outside of your fabric because you want it to be an invisible stitch from the outside of your fabric, from the outside of the garment. So that's just going to kind of tuck in there. And you're going to take up maybe 1 or 2 threads. Not very many at all. And yes, it will hold. I know it seems like that can't be very sturdy, but it will hold. So like 1 or 2 threads at most. Okay, and then come back over and right about the same level, you want to go the same direction. Again, my needle is still facing that direction. I'm just traveling in this direction. Okay. And what you're doing this entire time is creating little teeny tiny X's. You wouldn't normally turn the fabric this much. I'm just trying not to block the view of the camera is all. Whoops. Okay, that's a cross stitch or a herringbone stitch. Now, if you turn it over, you're barely gonna see it. And I'm using contrasting thread so you can see what the heck I'm doing, but you can barely see that on the other side. And that's the goal, so go me. So that's one way to hem a pair of pants. And I actually prefer this because again, even in that little tiny section, it still has some give in it. I don't know if you can see that or not. A little bit of give. Another way to hem something is what I learned as a whip stitch. So you come up on the inside of your rolled hem here. Okay, and again, we're looking at the inside of the garment here. This you've tucked and rolled your fabric up twice. This is an expanded version of what you would do. Probably not going to have an inch hem here, but you pick up 1 or 2 threads, and then you come back in through, you pick up your folded edge here. And then you pick up another thread from the outside of the fabric. Oops. And then you keep traveling with your needle through the folded edge. So if I was going to exaggerate how this actually looks, what I would do is you're going to pick up, if this is like 1 or 2 threads on this side, and you're going to go into the folded edge here. Okay. So that's an exaggerate. You really don't want to go that far because it'll tug on the outside of the fabric and make your hem a little bit weird. But again, if this one's done right, you really shouldn't see very much of it. And if you're not comfortable doing both of those steps at the same time, you can pick up 1 or 2 threads here and then come back under your folded edge and finish up your stitch. Okay. And it's not going to show, this is the exaggerated one, but again, it's not going to show very much on the other side. Sometimes you'll have a situation where you have 2 bits of fabric that are turned under, and you need to stitch them together kind of like that. So in this case, what you might want to do is called a ladder stitch. So you hide the end of your thread in one of the folds, and you go into the fold of the other side and out. And then where you came out on this fabric, you're going to go in on this fabric. So I'm going to go into the fold here and back out. That's not very easy to see, is it? Sorry. So I came out here and I'm going to go back in about the same length, so about the same place on the other fabric. And what you end up creating is sort of a ladder situation. It's easier to see when your threads come operating. There you go, sort of a ladder situation. So essentially what you've got here is a running stitch that alternates between this fabric and that fabric. So I'm going to continue on and go back in here, the same place that I came out the other side. And of course you wouldn't pull your fabric apart like that. I just wanted to show you what the pattern it's creating, which is kind of neat. Yeah. There we go. And it creates a relatively invisible seam there, which is kind of neat. Again, it does take some practice to get right along that fold, but once you've mastered it, it's not that bad. I know it really looks like I'm struggling. That's just because these pieces are so tiny and fiddly. It's not usually this difficult to do. So there you go, that's a ladder stitch. There's another way to hem that I didn't cover before that's very similar to the ladder stitch. This one can be called, I've heard it called an invisible stitch, and I've also heard it called a slip stitch. So you want to come in through your folded fabric, not here, but through the fold, so you can hide your knot. This is a good one to use when your seam might be seen from both sides. So we're very, very close to where you came out of the fold. That's where you want to pick up your 1 or 2 threads And then you're going to go back in exactly the same spot, right in the fold, and come back out. Whoops. And then you want to do the same thing. Pick up 1 or 2 threads. Get that guy out of the way so you can see what you're doing. And that way you've got a relatively invisible seam on both sides. Okay, the last stitch is a little bit more intense. It is a stitch that you would use to finish off a raw edge. This is called a blanket stitch, or I've also heard it called a buttonhole stitch. Now, I have, instead of having my thread doubled, it's actually quadrupled because you want a nice thick fabric, you want a nice thick thread here. If you don't have any buttonhole twist or buttonhole thread, you can just quadruple your thread like I have, and that works really, really well. So what you're gonna do is come up through the bottom of your fabric close to the edge. You're gonna go a lot closer, but this is just for, demonstration purposes here. And you're gonna come up again through very close to that. So you've got a loop. Go through the loop to create a knot. Now you want your knot to be along the edge of your fabric here. So the first one's gonna be a little bit wonky, no problem. The next one you're gonna do, again, very close. You're always going to come up from the same side. So this is related to the whip stitch, very similar. And again, you're going to want to create your knot. So what you're going to see is a bunch of stitches that are perpendicular to the edge of your fabric, and there's going to be knots all along here. So if you're using this to do a buttonhole by hand, those knots are what's going to protect your fabric from fraying. It's going to protect it from the buttons and all that wear. This is most often seen on historical garments when you have a hand-stitched buttonhole. Also, if you happen to have a sewing machine that either cannot do buttonholes, or you haven't worked out how to do buttonholes on your machine, or your machine is ornery like my old one and it doesn't like to do buttonholes, hand-stitched buttonholes are always an option. You don't want to pull too tight. You do need it to be snug, but you don't want it to be too tight. If it's too tight, it's going to start causing this little curve in your stitching, and it's not going to be nice and neat and tidy. So I'm going to loosen that up a little bit. Make sure, and see, I've messed this up too. So you can just fiddle with it and mess with it until you're happy with the way it looks. Again, this one takes a lot of practice to get it to be nice and even. And when you're doing your buttonhole, you're going to do them a little bit closer to the edge, and you're going to do them a little bit closer together. And that'll help. But this is, again, demonstration purposes. You come in your fold here. Try not to catch that fabric, the outside fabric on there. Oops, guess what? Forgot to knot it. Let's just do that whole bit again anyway. Oops, seem to have gotten a knot. Come on out of there, you. Well, that's new. There we go.